Okay, good morning, everybody. Today is October 1st, so we are officially in the new month. And before we get started, I want to just remind everybody that next week we are having exam one. It is the midterm exam. You can take it on Tuesday or Thursday. Pick the day that you want to come. I'm not doing a sign up or anything like that, and we're going to just see how that works, okay? If you do show up on Tuesday to take the test, that obviously means Thursday is a day off. You don't come Thursday at all. And week after next, we will start the second half of the course material. Now, I will be posting an announcement about the exam. So make sure that you log into Canvas, you read the announcement. I'll go into the other details that we may need to know in that. The simple way to put it is that the exam is going to have some multiple choice, the exam will have some short answer, and the exam will have an essay. Okay, now I'll put 2 essay questions on there and you'll do one. You'll pick the one you want to do, so there'll be a choice. Everybody in here has taken tests with those types of questions. Everybody knows how testing works, so that's not a problem. The study guide you will see in the modules as well. The study guide is nothing more than a bunch of terms. And if you understand those terms, if you go through and you can line those terms up and have a good working definition, then you're pretty much on track for the test. That's what that study guide is there for. And of course, I have to remind you, there is an awful lot of material that is really quite important that I have not gone over in the lectures. We just don't have enough time to sort all of that out. And there's also been these interruptions moving forward. So the material in the modules that is written, those written notes that I posted, by all means, those are what you study. Okay, those are what that's what I want you to know. So the lectures are complementing that material. I promise you, there are no trick questions, nothing designed to throw you off or mess with your head or anything like that. There is nothing on there that I am pulling out of left field. If it is on the exam, it is in one way or another covered in the posted notes. Is everyone following me? I'm not putting anything in there that I didn't talk about. The book is a great reference, so don't get me wrong, I think we got a great textbook, but I'm not putting anything on the test that is in the book that I didn't cover in the notes. Okay, so it is the notes that I posted that you need to study. And honestly, this is about as easy as tests get. I took it and made an A. As a matter of fact, I made 100 on it, so I'm really proud of myself. The reality is you study the notes, you learn the material, you come into class, put it back on the test, and there we are. It's just simple, just simple learning it, right? So that's what I want you to do. Now, I want to remind everybody, this is a test that I am giving in class. Everybody, even the people at home, I want you to come on either Tuesday or Thursday so that you can take this. In the event that you are quarantined, in the event that COVID-related issues are not allowing you to come out, by all means, if you're under COVID quarantine, do not come to campus. What I need you to do is get in touch with me so we can make proctor arrangements. Okay, so it's on you to make sure that I know you're under COVID quarantine so you can't come. But otherwise, Tuesday or Thursday, S27 on the Harrison County campus, formerly JD. So, are there any questions? Anything at all? Okay, that's great. Let's go ahead and get back to it. Now, we're definitely not going to finish up everything that will be on the test today. I just want to tell y'all, there's an awful lot of Napoleon that we will not get to, and that troubles me. But again, it is posted in the module, so let's go with that. So when we left off, we had just executed Louis XVI, right? And of course, Marie Antoinette came after that. Louis's execution absolutely shocked Europe all the way up to the very end. There were an awful lot of people that thought that they wouldn't actually do it, that this would probably result in some version of a pardon or something where he would simply be allowed to retire comfortably or something along those lines. But by this point, the hatred of the king and the radical nature of the revolution had pretty much taken over. And there was, this was more just out of vengeance and hatred than anything else. I mean, yes, Louis might have legally broken the law in some way or another, but any reasonable person would agree that he hadn't really done anything that warranted getting his head cut off, right? A few months later, they are going to execute Marie Antoinette. This is a sketch that was made of her just a few moments before she was let out of her jail cell and executed herself. And I think that it's fair to say that we would consider her kind of a tragic figure. Again, she never did anything that was worthy of execution, regardless of what you think about the death penalty. She didn't murder anybody. She didn't do anything awful. Her guilt, if she had any, was living like a queen when she was a queen, right? Yeah, that was what she was told to do, and that's what she was taught to do, and so that's what she did. And that's about the extent of it. And she was, of course, as we know, described as being very charming, very attractive, very feminine. But of course, she had been in jail now for well over a year and had been treated pretty roughly. And so this picture of her, she was 38 years old and she looked much older. Much of her hair had fallen out. She was in really, really bad shape. And that's really sad. And her children, and these were little children, were also imprisoned at this time and treated pretty horribly as well. So we're dealing with a group of people that we would consider victims. I don't know there's any other way to put it. And this reputation that she was somehow evil and uncaring and deserving of the guillotine, the truth just simply doesn't match up to that. Anyway, we are now going to enter a radical phase of the revolution with the Austrians and the Prussians invading, making significant progress. The government is in total chaos after the king's execution. And it's looking like in the spring of 1793 that France is actually going to lose this war, and that the Austrians and the Prussians are going to actually succeed in capturing Paris and putting in a government that they consider to be more appropriate. Well, in June, one political party who were quite radicals seized power, and they were known as the Jacobins. Fiercely committed to logic and reason, fiercely committed to the revolution, and strongly supportive of victory in the field and the revolution spreading to the rest of Europe. The Jacobins at the time looked like a group of guys that can turn things around. They presented themselves as tough and intelligent and logical, and you get the idea. Their leader was a fellow by the name of Maximilien Robespierre. And he would become the de facto leader of France over the next several months. And the Jacobins created a 12-member committee of public safety, which ruled France under what it would consider to be emergency powers. So now the assembly doesn't even have any power anymore. And under this version of a dictatorship, they reorganized the army, rearranged the officer corps to put talent in the field. They regulated the price of food, making it affordable, and subsidized agriculture to make sure that farmers wouldn't go broke if that happened. They very effectively promoted a propaganda campaign that rallied the people behind the revolution, behind the war, etc. And it's worth noting that by this point, things had become so chaotic that there was even a counter-revolution against the revolution. This area here that you see as orange were actually now regions of the country that were revolting against Paris. And so when I say it was chaotic, I mean it. You don't even know who's in charge depending on where you are in France. Some wanted to restore some other version of a republic. Some wanted to restore the monarchy. Obviously, we have Prussia and Austria controlling parts of the country. Things are pretty rough. They implement a draft where they're now conscripting young men to fight in the military. And before you think, okay, well, these guys are kind of getting it together and maybe they can sort it out and bring back normalcy, no. The dark side of the Jacobin rule was that they controlled the French people through an extreme program of violence and intimidation. They also implemented what has now come to be called the Reign of Terror. Due process and the court system was suspended under the emergency powers. And Robespierre demanded that anyone perceived as an enemy of the revolution should simply be executed, and there is no time for any kind of fair trial to take place. And so immediately all across France, guillotines were erected, and anybody and everybody that had been associated with the old regime or was perceived to be against the war or was in any way an enemy of the revolution was simply rolled in and had their head cut off. And the minute this started happening, of course, we start seeing people executed for all kinds of stupid reasons. You know, the idea is if I heard you speaking out against it, or if you grumbled, or if I want to settle a score, whatever it may be, all of a sudden we're just going to start cutting people's heads off left and right. In some regions of France, the executions were so frequent that the guillotines couldn't even keep up. You know, they were lining people up every day, and so many people were getting their heads cut off, just whack, 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 that they couldn't use the guillotine anymore. They, you know, in one place, they just started lining people up and blowing them apart with grape shot so we can kill lots of people at once. In one instance, they chained 500 enemies of the state to a barge and sunk it in the Loire River, a mass drowning. A lot of those were priests. Then, of course, they didn't think about what happens when 500 dead bodies are decomposing in a river. Not a pleasant experience. Because logic and reason are now the ultimate authority in France, the church was outlawed. It is now illegal to practice Christianity because, of course, this is illogical to worship a magic man in the sky and follow the Bible, which makes no sense. In its place, Robespierre declared the Church of Reason, where we will now worship logic, we will now worship rationality. And all of the religious iconography was removed from churches, and in Notre Dame Cathedral, they erected images of great philosophers like Socrates and Plato and people like that. We will now have the metric system instead of the old system of weights and measures. Because, of course, a metric system is a far more logical way of doing it. And you say to yourself, actually, that's not a bad idea. The metric system is better, but everything has to be metric now. They even had a metric calendar where there's 10 months out of the year and 10 days in a month and 10 hours in a day, which does not work at all in terms of how astronomy is. And nobody could figure out what time it is. Even the months were changed. We would have new names for each of the 10 months because the old style referenced the Greek gods, and we can't have that. Before long, nobody really knew what was worse, the war being lost, or the fighting with the Austrians and the Prussians, or having to live under a regime that'll cut your head off if you look at them the wrong way. And historians now, of course, have studied this left and right, and the going understanding now is that the overwhelming majority of people that were victims of the Reign of Terror not only were not guilty of doing anything wrong, but they were not the nobility and the elites and the people who were oppressing France under the old regime. These were ordinary peasants, ordinary people who just happened to have the wrong opinion or were accused of something. Keep in mind, during the Reign of Terror, all I have to do is say, that guy is an enemy, and all of a sudden, you lose your head. Now, you might be a guy that I don't like. You might be somebody who I have a score to settle with. It just doesn't make any sense. Within about 10 months, the Austrians and Prussians had largely been pushed back. A degree of order started emerging. And when you are such a brutal dictator, when you are such a cruel human being as Robespierre, you're going to make a lot of enemies. And in the summer of 1794, and I'm not going into details, but it finally caught up with him. He himself was put on trial for treason after he was overthrown, and he was sent to the guillotine. So in many respects, Robespierre himself was the last victim of the Reign of Terror. And we can see the caricatures as this is going on. You decided that you were going to overthrow this old system that you thought was so terrible. You were going to go in and do it better. You thought that, we're going to completely rewrite the rules of society. And all those people who were ruling over us are evil. Well, okay, go right ahead. What's the old phrase? Be careful what you wish for, right? You might get it. Sure, let's put the poor, ignorant, unsophisticated people in charge. Let's decide that we'd all be a lot better off if we just killed everybody who had been in charge before, right? Let's see what's going to happen there. And of course, here we have these people, and they're celebrating as the nobility and church have all been guillotined. Boy, that's a world I want to live in, right? Here you have the man sitting up, laughing as the streets are full of violence and chaos, because that's how things are going to be better. It kind of reminds us of if you go to a bunch of little kids who are angry that mom and dad are giving them chores, and angry that mom and dad make them play by rules, and angry that they can't do what they want. What's going to happen if mom and dad walk away and say, okay, fine, you can stay up as late as you want. You don't have to do any work. You don't have to follow any rules, right? If you think I'm an arbitrary tyrant, fine, kid, live however you want. Is that kid going to be better off? No, right? The reality is there do have to be people in charge. There does have to be law and order. There does have to be a system of governance. The old regime was not fair, not at all. It is true, however, that the old regime maintained order. The old regime kept society moving forward. And I can assure you, at the height of the Reign of Terror, the people living in the streets of Paris were looking back with great nostalgia at the days when King Louis maintained order and everything was not like this. So the trick here is to say, okay, when the system isn't working, we need to change it. But you don't change the system by implementing a reign of terror, do you? Real logic and reason says change has to be done peacefully. Change has to be done through an honest system of reform. Everybody's voice has to be heard. You don't just turn the reins over to people like this. And so finding that balance is what we learn from the French Revolution. What we also learn here is that logic and reason don't necessarily give us all the answers, do they? We all like logic. We all like reason. We all like the ideals behind the Enlightenment. But at the same time, no single philosophy has all of the answers, right? No single philosophy works for everybody every time. And if your version of logic and reason is let's hang all of the priests, well, that doesn't sound very logical to me. You get where I'm coming from? So that's really what we're looking at here. There's a very, very difficult balance that a society has to try to find in implementing law and order, giving freedom, etc. Yeah, go ahead.
Now that we're actually going over this, I kind of want to change my answer for your discussion question.
Oh, yeah. Hey, that's good. That's good. Yeah, the discussion. Which question was it? Which one?
It was the logic and reason over morals and I guess
like tradition. Yeah.
Tradition.
Well, what I hope you figured out with my discussion questions, and I hope you see this, is that I'm deliberately constructing them to make sure that there really isn't a winning answer, is there? Mm-hmm. There's no right answer with any of my discussion questions. It's always just simply a matter of perspective.
That question, you're like, well, America was founded on both.
It was, right? America was founded, our founding fathers absolutely considered themselves philosophes. They did. But our founding fathers, and keep this in mind, our Constitution was ratified in 1788, right? And we mentioned earlier, the American Revolution and the French Revolution kind of happened at the same time, right? And if you had gone, and we think of our founding fathers as being obviously, open-minded, democracy, freedom, right? Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, the Constitution, this is a big deal. But George Washington was president when this was going on. And he was absolutely appalled at what was happening in France, as any rational person would be, right? And if we would go to the founding fathers of this country and say, what's happening over in France and why are we not having a reign of terror over here? They would say, well, over in France, they're giving power to everybody, right? Our founding fathers actually didn't believe in that. Remember, who votes in the 1790s? White men with property, right? So if you are not a white man with property, you don't vote in the early American Republic. And George Washington would say, there's a reason why we're not letting illiterate people vote. There's a reason why we're not letting people vote who don't own property. There's a reason we're not letting people vote who haven't really proven that they can think critically. Now, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with them. I'm not advocating one idea over another, right? But George Washington would say this is what happens when revolutions go too far. And so, it's a complicated balance that we try to strike. It really is, and I'm glad you brought that up, right? I'm glad you brought that up. How do you create a perfect government? You don't, right? How do you create a government? Well, everybody matters and everybody has authority and everybody is allowed to express themselves. We're big fans of democracy. I hope you exercise that principle here in just a few weeks. Anyway, moving forward. But this also ties back to the idea that every time one group gets in power, they take care of themselves, right? When the wealthy elites are in power, they take care of the wealthy elites. When the middle class is in power, they take care of themselves. When the poor, unsophisticated people take over, they take everything from everybody else, right? So, complicated. Oh, here's the Church of Reason. All right, we're going to worship the God of, Socrates and logic and I don't know. Anyway, with the war over, a new constitution was written, the reign of terror came to an end, and that really leads us to the second phase of the French Revolution. And I'm going to run through his early years a lot quicker than I normally do. A new government was put in place by 1795 that was pretty similar to what had been in place at the beginning of the revolution. And the middle classes took over. We will call them the Thermidorians. There is a legislature, there is a chief executive, people elect their leaders. Voting is restricted to the middle classes, which angers the working classes, and we're going to see this cause problems all the way up to 1848. And although there is a degree of stability for about a year or two, there's also tremendous political tension. Because a lot of people want to bring back the Bourbons, bring back the monarchy. They see the reign of terror that had just happened, and their logic is, as bad as it was under King Louis, at least he maintained order and stability, and so maybe society needs that. And then there are, of course, the radicals on the other side that haven't really gone away. Those that had supported Robespierre, those that had supported major changes, and they're not happy either. And a lot of people are arguing that the Thermidorians, this middle class that's trying to create a government very similar to what we see in the United States, by the way, that these people have really just created a noble class for themselves. They're not looking out for the poor and the working classes. They're not looking out for everybody. They're just looking out for them. And if you go to one of these people and say, why shouldn't illiterate people vote? Why shouldn't people without property vote? Well, you can automatically see something's not fair here, right? Something's going on here that's taking power away from the people who also deserve to have a voice. So what about Napoleon? Let me talk about him very briefly, again, a lot more quickly than I would like. Napoleon was not actually French. He was from the island of Corsica. Let me go here if I can show you. Which is between France and Italy. You can zoom in there. It's that orange island between France and Italy. It is controlled by France. Whoops. Now, Corsica is politically in the French system, but it's hard to say if the Corsicans are French, if they're Italian, or somewhere in between. They are sort of their own ethnicity. The French that they speak has a heavy accent that's very influenced by Italian. So the point is, Napoleon is kind of on the outside. Not entirely, but a little bit. His family were lower nobility. They were at the low end of the noble ladder. They were basically middle class. So he grew up privileged. He grew up better off than most. As a young man in a prosperous family, he was given an excellent education, and in his teenage years, he went to school at military academies, which was very typical for the children of lesser nobility in France. And the idea was, you go to military academy, you get out, you will become an officer in the French army, you serve a career in the military, and then you can get out when you're middle-aged and become prosperous as a noble business type. You get the idea. That's kind of the life of the middling nobility. Privileged, but one where you're still going to work pretty hard. Napoleon was by any measure an absolutely brilliant student. He was the equivalent of the valedictorian, 4.0, magna cum laude, whatever term you want to use that would define modern education. Napoleon would fit that. His instructors talked about how he is by far the most talented student at the school. There's straight A's in every subject. You get the idea. And this kid is going places. He was expected to move up the ranks of the army. This man is going to be a general someday. This man is going to be a very high-ranking person. His specialty, if we want to call it that, was in artillery. He was trained to be an artillery officer. And he would later come up with new uses of artillery. He came up with the idea of using the artillery as an offensive weapon rather than a defensive weapon. Up to that point, you use the artillery when the enemy is charging you, and you shoot at them to stop the charge. It's like a wall to block them. And he said, no, let's move the artillery forward. Let's go forward with our troops with the artillery, which is a very different way of using it. And I'm not a big fan of warfare and killing people or anything else. I'm just pointing out that when battles need to be won, well, there you go. Napoleon fought as an artillery officer in that Prussian-Austrian war that we have just gotten through talking about. And he did very, very well. He stood out for his ability to lead men on the field. And it's worth noting, I need to point this out, when I say he was educated at military academies, I'm not saying that all he received was an education on how to fight and win wars. These military academies would give you a comprehensive education. It was like a university education. They studied every subject. Military academies are not just teaching you how to be a soldier. They're comprehensive in nature. And in fact, the most important subjects were math and engineering. Military academies put a real emphasis on that because you have to be able to build forts. You have to be able to construct things. Armies win wars at this time by building And so engineering is particularly important. But there was not a subject that he did not master. Moving forward very quickly, when the Thermidorians are in charge in 1795, Napoleon is commanding an artillery company near Paris, and there was a riot that took place. A riot emerged, and it was a royalist revolt. A group of people that wanted to restore the Bourbons had a big old demonstration in the streets, and they wanted to overthrow the government. So Napoleon and his men were called in, and they did not negotiate with the crowd. Napoleon lined up the cannons, filled them with grape shot, and just blasted it right into the crowd without even talking to them. Later in life, Napoleon would say, I did negotiate with them. I negotiated with grape shot. And he pointed out that they were all a bunch of cowards, and he proved it. They scattered like rats the minute real men showed up, was kind of how he put it. So that royalist revolt, it was put down like that. And Napoleon made it clear to the government, I am middle class. I am for exactly the type of government that you are pushing for. And if you ever need me again, you just tell me. We are never going to see another reign of terror if I have anything to say about it. And we will never restore the Bourbons and bring back the old regime. We are going to create a logic-based republic, not unlike the United States again. Now, keep in mind, Napoleon's got his own plan, as you can probably guess. We might not be bringing back the Bourbons, but we might just bring back absolutism. We're not there yet. Napoleon, because of his loyalty to the government, of course, was promoted very quickly. He will eventually become a general in the army. He was given command of a big group of soldiers, actually in Italy at the time, which made sense given his background. And moving very quickly, in 1797, he convinced the Thermidorian government to let him invade Egypt. Give me the ability to go over and win something big for France so that we will all be heroes and we will keep getting reelected. Now you think to yourself, what the heck is going on here? Why would he want to invade Egypt? Where does this come from? Well, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. Egypt has recently broken away from the Ottoman Empire. We've talked about this before. And I need a better map. I'm sorry. No, it doesn't show it here. I apologize. I really should have a better map here. But the Mediterranean, which is the body of water between Africa and Europe, it's a sea, links up to the Indian Ocean by a very tiny stretch of land that is in present-day Egypt, that is in Egypt. And all it is a big flat piece of desert. And it is understood that before long, we're going to dig a canal connecting the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. And what this will enable is shipping to go from southern Europe to the Indian Ocean. And today that canal is called the Suez Canal. So Egypt is a strategic gold mine. Egypt itself actually has a lot of gold from southern Africa, from Central Africa. And Egypt also produces a lot of food. Egypt is a big jewel in the crown of any country that controls it. And the Egyptians have just broken away from the Ottomans, from the Turks. Napoleon concludes that if we can take Egypt, it will give us an advantage over our perpetual rivals, the English. Because England, Britain, is definitely eyeing Egypt. Britain is looking at Egypt and saying, we want that. We want to be able to have that canal that will soon be built. We want all the advantages of control. And as the Ottoman Empire continues to dissolve, everybody is thinking these are prizes that we can take. So if we can go in as French, make sure the British don't come in, take over Egypt, build a Suez Canal, it will be glorious for the French people. And the Thermidorians agree. So the French invade Egypt with 35,000 men under the command of Napoleon. The entire campaign is an utter disaster. Napoleon grossly miscalculated everything about this. Maintaining an army in Egypt is a heck of a lot harder than he had thought. It is a desert after all. But also, the British were not about to let the French have it. Not even subject to negotiation. And what the British had that the French didn't, at least on the same level, was a powerful navy. Napoleon was a brilliant commander in the field. He was a brilliant commander when it comes to armies. He was woefully incompetent when it came to navies. And the British Navy always made a meal of the French Navy during the Napoleonic era. And this is an example. The Battle of the Nile involved the British Navy coming in. They blew the French Navy to shreds. They're going to do it again at the Battle of Gibraltar a few years later. And what that did was trap Napoleon in Egypt with no way to supply his men. And so the whole Egyptian campaign turned into a nightmare. Now, on the plus side, they found the Rosetta Stone, so now we can translate hieroglyphics. That's a nice thing, but it's ancillary to what's going on here. Instead of recognizing the defeat, all they did when Napoleon got back, and he actually abandoned his troops in Egypt. He was able to get home himself, but he left a lot of them behind. The government just promoted him as a hero, called it a victory, had big parades in his honor, and the French people kind of forgot about it. So even though this should have ended his career, the government wasn't going to let it bring down them too. So they glossed over it, and Napoleon didn't actually suffer politically as a result. Now again, I'm moving forward kind of quickly. Over the next few years, he continued to increase his influence within the government. And in 1799, he and 3 other men actually launched a peaceful coup, putting them in charge. They launched a peaceful coup, putting them in charge. And Napoleon was declared first consul, kind of like Julius Caesar with Pompey and Crassus. 3 of us are in charge, but I'm going to be the top man. Only Caesar never even let him get that far whenever he did it. I'm hinting at something there. So Napoleon by 1800 is dictator. He writes a new constitution, making him effectively dictator for life. He is very popular among the French people. The economy is now coming back. He regulates bread prices. He implements reforms that are good for business. He is constantly discussing the merits of the revolution. We've been through a lot this past decade. I get it, it's been rough, but we've made it through, and now we're better off as a result. We're going to use logic and reason, but we're going to do it the right way this time. And so the French people love him, and the French people see him as exactly what we need to get us through these tough times. You get the idea. So now we really only have one more step for Napoleon to take. In 1804, riding this huge wave of popularity, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. Not king, emperor. Now, restoring the monarchy with the Bonapartes now in charge is kind of a radical move. But he insisted that this is very different from what had come under the old regime. And it started, of course, with his very coronation ceremony. Under the old regime, when a king was crowned, of course, this is a religious ceremony, and in Reims Cathedral, the king walks down the aisle and he kneels before the Pope, of course, and the Pope puts the crown on his head, effectively ordaining him king. You know, the Pope is saying, God has chosen you to be the king of the French people. And there would be a big cross on top of the crown showing that this is God's will, and now all you French people need to respect your new king, probably named Louis. That's not how it happened with Napoleon. It was in Notre Dame Cathedral, not the traditional cathedral where the earlier kings had been crowned. And when Napoleon walked down the aisle, the Pope was sitting there. And the Pope did not put the crown on Napoleon's head. Napoleon reached out, took it from the Pope, turned around, and put it on his own head. And he was making a clear point. God did not make me king or emperor. I did this. I rose from the ranks, I worked hard, I earned it, and I am crowning myself. And the story had always been that this angered the Pope and he didn't know that this was going to happen. That's not true. This was all planned in advance. And you can be certain the Pope did not want to cooperate with it, but he had no choice. By this point, Napoleon is too powerful. He is too popular. And Napoleon is allowing the church to come back. Remember, the church was made illegal and all the property was confiscated. He doesn't give the property back, but Napoleon is permitting the church to reopen. So the Pope is kind of over a barrel on this one. Now, this picture here is the one that always is shown when we talk about this. This was painted by a man named David, Jacques-Louis David. He is the artist of the entire French Revolution and Napoleonic era. He painted a lot of stuff before. He will paint a lot of stuff afterwards. He was a brilliant artist, but his whole goal here was to just show things as they were. And this is a picture of Napoleon. He has already crowned himself, and now his wife Josephine is kneeling, and he is about to put the imperial crown, the empress crown, on her. That's what's happening there. So he has already crowned himself, and now she gets crowned as well. Now let's take a look at what we really mean here. This is Napoleon in his, royal imperial portrait, standing there looking awesome. Now, is Napoleon looking for glory? Is Napoleon looking for power for himself? Does Napoleon have a bit of an ego? Having risen from the ranks of the lower nobility to now be emperor of the French. Well, you tell me. He's standing here looking awesome, and when we're done with that, how about we have another one, right? How about we do another picture? This time I'm going to put my hand out. And now, what the heck? Let's do this one, right? One from the hip. All right, and if you're the artist, you're not going home yet. Let's have another one. This time I'm putting hand on the hip. I'm going to be awesome, right? What's that? Oh, you can't? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. You can't. Okay, there we go. There's that one here, right? Let's do this one. I forget, I've got two pictures going. Okay, let's do this one. Okay, are we good? Are we good? Okay, now let's look awesome that way. Let's gaze that way. Okay, now I'm going to be holding the ball of earth. Okay, I gotta look good on that one too. Ooh, okay, now I'm getting a little tired. Let's sit down. All right, let's do one more, right? Oh, what the heck? Let's do one more after that. Are you getting the idea here? This man's got a bit of an ego. Now, I want you to look a little bit more closely at this. And I want you to think about the pictures that we put up of Louis XIV, Louis XV, Louis XVI. Yes, these are both pictures of obviously a king emperor type. That medallion around his neck is the medallion of the French monarch. The Bourbons wore it too. But I want you to look at the style of that imperial robe. I I want you to think for a second, okay, that doesn't look quite like what the earlier French kings wore. It's cut a little bit different. If you didn't know better, what does that kind of look like? If we look at the style of that outfit there. And I want you to look at this here. Why don't we go back to another one? And there's little hints. Look at that crown he's wearing. That doesn't look like the crown a French king would wear. You're getting there. Greek, or maybe a little louder. Maybe we look a little Roman here. Maybe we've got a Roman emperor vibe going on. Here's, our Roman patrician in his toga, right? Notice the purple robe with the toga cut underneath, right? Maybe Napoleon isn't trying to look like a French king. Maybe he is trying to look like Augustus. Or maybe he's trying to look like Diocletian, right? Are you kind of seeing it, right? Maybe he's trying to look like Belushi, right? Are you seeing the familiarity there? And obviously y'all have never seen that movie. You think you have? Well, you should. Anyway, Napoleon is not just interested in being the French king, or for that matter, turning France into a modern, enlightened state. Napoleon has a much, much bigger plan in mind. Napoleon looks back at ancient Rome and sees it as a highlight, a zenith of culture and power. He idolizes Caesar and that era. And what he wants to do is completely reshape Europe and create a new Rome, with Paris as the capital and him as the Caesar. The logic, the values, the glory, the greatness that had been Rome, we are going to bring back in the modern era. When the Romans would win a big victory or have a great accomplishment, they would create what are known as victory arches. We have the Ark of Titus and the Ark of Constantine and the Ark of I don't know, whoever. And at the top, it explains, this ark has been created to celebrate, the conquest of the Cretans at Sparta or the Spartans at Crete. Well, of course, Napoleon orders his own victory ark. A new victory ark in the center of Paris to proclaim the new Rome that has been created. We are bringing it back in a modern form. And this is not going to just be France. I am going to spread this across Europe. We are going to spread what he would call the revolution everywhere, across the continent, corner to corner. France is only the beginning. So within that, what we see here is a man that fully intends to conquer the continent. Now, this is a map from a little bit later, but we can see this. He divided France and a lot of territory he conquered into logical districts, all answerable to him. And Paris is the center. Paris is the hub. It will become the primate city of this new empire. So he centralizes the government. He reforms everything about the political system and the domestic structures of France. He introduces, for example, universal public education based on a secular curriculum. Every French child will now go to school, paid for by the state, and they will be taught the Enlightenment. Under an earlier French regime. Under the old regime, everybody's got their place. The nobility are there to rule, the middle classes are there to be the bureaucracy, and of course the peasants are there to do the work. And if you are born into that class, society expects you to stay in that class. That's how it works. Everybody knows their place. Napoleon says absolutely not. What we do is we rise and fall based on our own merits. Just because you're born down here doesn't mean you have to die there. You will determine your place in society through how hard you work and the effort that you put into advancing yourself. So we are going to reward intelligence and competence. And of course, we will have disincentives to not be that way. That's logical. That's the Enlightenment, right? Napoleon would say, I was not born the emperor, but I became the emperor through my own effort. And if you want to rise up, go out there and work, and I want to create that opportunity for you. So everybody goes to school. He, of course, insisted that he was a friend of the middle class, encouraging business and industry to come into France. He pushed for the modernization of infrastructure, roads, bridges, ports, canals. Now, what he is most proud of is the new universal law code that he expects everyone to live under. Of course, it will be called the Code Napoleon. And what you didn't pick up on in those pictures, although I hope maybe you did, is that most of these he's posing right next to it. He is so proud of the Code Napoleon, a new set of laws that will form the basis of his new Rome. They are based on logic, reason. They open the door for people to work their way to the top. They create incentives for people to make the best of themselves, which he argued the old regime did everything to prevent. The only thing the old regime was designed to do was to keep the nobility rich and powerful, keep the peasants in the field, and keep the middle classes doing the brain work. And Napoleon said that was a corrupt and toxic way to run a government. Let's completely change it. Now, before you say Napoleon was awesome, keep in mind there's a very dark underside to this. Napoleon eliminated the free press. He is not interested in people criticizing him. And so it's impossible to have a problem with what he's doing. You don't get to print what you want to print. You print what he tells you to print. Napoleon, at one point, quit reading the newspapers completely because he argued they only print what I want them to anyway. I already know what's in the paper. I write a small history article in one of the local papers, and every once in a while people would say, well, did you read your article? And I say, no, I didn't. Right? I haven't read my article in the paper in years, and the reason is because I don't have to. I wrote it, right? I don't need to read what I wrote. It's kind of the same thing. They're only printing what I want. Why should I read the paper? Napoleon's schools, of course, only taught what Napoleon wanted them to. And that's how Napoleon is awesome, and the revolution is being preserved, and your job is to completely support this. Again, children are indoctrinated, even though they are also taught important subjects. We like public education, and this is a brilliant move forward, but if you assume that it was somehow objective and neutral, no, it wasn't. Now, Napoleon was not personally religious. He was a Christian on paper, but certainly not in any real practice, and he didn't really buy into the belief in any notable way. He completely subordinated the church. He allowed the church to operate, but he did not give the church any kind of special privileges, and he was perfectly happy if people had nothing to do with it. You have freedom of religion under Napoleon, and if you want to show up and give these people your money, go right ahead, but nobody's forcing you. That was his logic behind the church. Also, under the Code Napoleon, women are not equal to men. Again, there is a dark side to this. Now, this is par for the course at this time. We know we were living in a man's world, but the Code Napoleon put it on paper. The women are expected to be subservient to the men in their lives. Wives must obey their husbands. The man goes out and works. The woman stays home and takes care of the kids. You get the idea. He was certainly no feminist. No way. Napoleon created a national bank, much like the national bank created in the United States that was spearheaded by Alexander Hamilton. And we'll consider that one a good thing. He also regulated bread prices and subsidized agriculture. He was no dummy. Keep food cheap and they don't riot. It is a long-held rule that is just as valid today as it was then. Riots start happening when the people get hungry. And you want to talk about creating a new Rome, you better believe the Roman emperors knew that. Augustus Caesar, the first real man to be emperor, openly said, the reason why I do everything I want is because I give people food and I keep them entertained. Kind of scary today, right? Because, food is cheap and y'all watch reality TV all day, right? Kind of scary. Kind of scary. People are not watching what they need to be watching. Newsflash, you don't learn about the world by watching TikTok, right? Cat videos are not going to tell you who you need to vote for. They're not going to give you the ability to critically think and figure out where you stand on very important issues that affect your lives. What's going on with college tuition right now? What's happening with college tuition? Anyone in here happy with tuition? Anyone in here happy with what you're paying? Tuition is going up at 4 times the rate of inflation. Okay, college tuition is going up 4 times the rate of inflation. In fact, college tuition is going up at a faster rate than medical care. If you think medical care is getting expensive, you want to look at what it costs to go to college. I'm not happy about that. Why do you think college tuition keeps going through the roof? It's because young people don't vote. The people that have an influence over college tuition are our elected officials. And the elected officials respond to the voters. They don't respond to the people. They respond to the people who can fire them. And if young people don't vote, young people get stuck with the bill. So if you want college tuition to go down, vote, right? Now, why am I segueing onto that? Keep bread cheap, keep people entertained, and you can do anything you want, right? None of y'all are hungry, and all y'all are doing is watching TikTok. That means we can raise tuition and y'all can't do anything about it. So please, pretty please, watch other things. Pay attention. Develop an opinion. I don't care who you vote for, but show up and vote, okay? Is that a deal? Everyone?
I just got registered.
Good. Excellent. Excellent. That data, who votes, what age they are, that's the kind of data that politicians actually study. No, they don't know who you voted for, but they know that if they make you mad, you'll vote them out, right? That's what matters. And Napoleon turned out to be not such a great leader because at the end of the day, he is not he's not a democratically elected leader. He is somebody who can do whatever he wants. And once he was given that absolute power, he drives all of the greatness into the ground. And that's what we have to get to next, which we won't be able to finish. But you have to study that. Very quickly before we have to go, and this is all in the module, so Napoleon definitely brings himself down, and it is his own ego that does it, his own ambition that does it. Napoleon was able to very successfully win on the battlefield during the first decade of the 19th century. From roughly 1800 to 1810, it seemed like there was not a battle he could lose. And as we've mentioned before, there is no disputing the man was a brilliant military commander. He led his men in the field in addition to being the Emperor of France. He was a hardworking guy. He was so dominant on the battlefield. He was so good that the entire rules of how wars are fought were rewritten around what he did. Napoleonic tactics would become a new type of warfare. And I hate warfare and I hate all of it, and it was cruel and millions of people died needlessly. So I'm not praising him for this. I'm just saying it's what it is. He was able to utterly destroy an Austrian and Russian army in 1805, the Battle of Austerlitz, which put Austria completely under his thumb. And in 1807, he was able to utterly destroy the Prussians as well. That's Prussia with a P, which were the two of the three great powers to the east, which enabled him to effectively redraw the map of Central Europe, giving France all of the power. And so you can see here, France is now vastly bigger. He cuts the Austrians off from the water. He shrinks Prussia down and keeps them to the east of Denmark. This is a map that gives France everything and enables him to directly or indirectly control the entire continent all the way to Russia. And he did it because his army made it possible. He won battles in the field. And of course, observers were just flabbergasted at how talented he was at winning these wars. He was really at the zenith of his power in 1810. And I know we got to move very quickly, so you're going to have to pick up the rest of this in the notes. And you're also going to have to read about the Congress of Vienna in the notes. My goodness, the Congress of Vienna is important because we're rebuilding Europe after Napoleon with this. The two nations that refused to cooperate with him, that refused to negotiate, that refused to play by his rules, were Russia and Britain. And although the Tsar did work with him from time to time and consider an alliance, the Tsar was eventually smart enough to understand that Napoleon is not this great man, that Napoleon is in fact a tyrant. Ironic, coming from a Tsar after all. And so by about 1810, Tsar Alexander had come to conclude that he must be the one to defeat Napoleon. The British can't do it because they don't have an army on the continent. They had defeated the French Navy, but they weren't able to defeat the army. And somebody has to take down this tyrant. Somebody has to bring him down. The world itself is threatened if we don't get rid of him, and everybody is gone but me. And so he vowed that he is going to bring down Napoleon at any cost. And at any cost means at any cost to the Russian people. He would even get to the point, and he was a bit of a kind of a walking to his own beat. He would eventually just sort of disappear and go live with some weird mystic. But anyway, that's a different story. He began to preach that God put him on earth to defeat Napoleon, that it was his sacred duty. And the reason why he was given command of the largest nation in Europe with all of the resources was because God had intended to give him everything he needed. You know, someone's got to stop this guy, and that someone is just going to have to be me. Well, in 1812, Napoleon invaded. Here he is forcing the Prussian king to kneel before him or kiss his ring. Here is a caricature at the time with Britain and France. We have Napoleon carving off Europe, and we have Britain carving off the rest of the world because of their powerful navy. And the joke is there's nothing left for the rest of the world. You know, they're dividing the world between the two of them. It's a great, great cartoon. This is a depiction of the Battle of Trafalgar. Did I say Gibraltar earlier? Whoops, I think I might have said Gibraltar. Trafalgar, which was fought off Gibraltar in southern Spain. The Battle of Trafalgar was the battle where the British destroyed the French Navy, just absolutely sunk it. And the hero of the Battle of Trafalgar was Admiral Horatio Nelson. And to this day, Horatio Nelson is considered the great hero to the British people. He was killed at the very end of the battle. And the park right in front of Buckingham Palace is called Trafalgar Square. And this is often considered to be the battle that saved the British Empire because the French Navy was now defeated, so Britain could continue to operate on the high seas. Anyway, this is an embargo that Napoleon tried to put on the continent known as the Continental System, which is in the notes I can't get into. But anyway, in 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with 600,000 men. Easily the largest army that had ever been assembled in human history. And I sure wish that I could talk about it in more detail, but here's the gist of it. Russia is so big and so vast that the French army, along with a lot from Central Europe at that time, that were now his allies, kept going deeper and deeper into Russia because the Russian army would not fight him. And honestly, it's because they weren't together enough. They wanted to, but they didn't have their act together. And as he went deeper and deeper into Russia, the supply lines eventually started failing. And his army started getting weaker and weaker. And the Russian people were, of course, burning their crops and scorching the earth, so there was nothing the French could eat. And although there was an enormously bloody battle right outside of Moscow, Napoleon finally made it into the city, which of course had then been lit on fire. And this was in October of 1812. Now, once he is in the city, which is now in ruins, with all of the food discovered, the Tsar refuses to meet with them, refuses to surrender. The Tsar has now retreated far east. Napoleon had a meeting with his top advisors, and he met with Admiral Akbar, who said the one thing that we all know Admiral Akbar says. What is it? It's a trap. It's a trap. And it's also a joke, of course. But you get the idea. What happens? Napoleon is stuck in Moscow with no food, no winter equipment, and it's October. And I don't need to tell you what winters are like in Russia. By now, actually, half of his army has already died. And so immediately he tries to hightail it out as fast as he can, realizing all of my men are going to starve to death or freeze to death. And the march out of Russia was an utter nightmare, an absolute nightmare. And his men just started dropping by the thousands on the way back. And of course, that's when the Russian army started attacking them. And so now they're having to fight battles in these conditions. And the Russians, of course, are nice and warm and well prepared. And it was just an absolute disaster. And the one thing that you need to know is that when you talk to the Russians today, don't say that it was the Russian winter that defeated Napoleon, right? They will be more than happy to correct you. They will say our army defeated Napoleon, but the winter certainly most definitely played a role. So by the time Napoleon got out of Russia in 1812, only about 18,000 of his 600,000 man army had survived. It just 18,000. Yeah, but he invaded with 600,000. So, it was just gone. The Grand Army no longer existed. And that made him too weak to fight anymore. And he was eventually defeated and he was eventually overthrown. Now, I don't have an opportunity to go over everything else. Again, I really wish that I did. Although it is worth noting, once the French were completely out of Russia and Napoleon was defeated, the Russians decided to build this. Yeah, if they're not making a point with that. So, again, the Russians will be more than happy to point out that they finally took care of this little guy when nobody else could. And it's a source of great pride to the Russian people that they defeated Napoleon. And it's also worth noting, and I don't have time to go into all the details, Napoleon stayed in power for a few more years. The Battle of Waterloo that y'all have heard of was part of his last stand. He was actually kicked off the throne briefly, but then he returned and came back. There's a whole story behind that I wish I could discuss. But we don't have time to go into it. But what is worth noting, and I do want to eventually get to World War II about this, when the Russians made it to Paris with all of the other allies that were now turned on Napoleon, the Russians were allowed to go in first. And Tsar Alexander led his army into Paris first after having conquered Napoleon. And the Tsar made it very clear that Paris was not to be hurt. We will not burn the city. We will not molest the French people. The Russians were under very rigid orders to behave themselves, if you will. And by all accounts, they did. And the Tsar was the first to demand that a constitutional government be put in place and was a strong advocate for not real retribution against France for all that had happened, which when you realize what the French had done to him was a pretty impressive and a pretty good thing. It really showed the decency that Alexander had. So that's worth noting as we move into World War II. And so kind of take a hint from that. But what I want you to study, Napoleon was at one point sent to a beautiful island in the Mediterranean, but he didn't stay and he tried to come back. I mentioned that earlier, and Waterloo was a result of that. Here is a caricature of him being sent away. Eventually, the Bourbons were restored. King Louis XVIII, who was Louis XVI's brother, was put on the throne. There he is, looking more like a Bourbon king. You see the difference. A little bit of Napoleonic influence there, I guess. Here is Napoleon's return. He was finally sent to the island of St. Helena, which is in the middle of the Atlantic, and it's barren, and nobody can realistically get there. The British looked over him, and apparently he also got pregnant. You'll have to figure that one out. But Napoleon died in 1822, and that was the end of him. Now, again, what I want you to do is study the Congress of Vienna. I've got a whole big section in the modules on that, because rebuilding Europe after all of these years of chaos is going to be a bit contentious. But we are out of time. Okay, remember, everybody, we have our exam Tuesday and Thursday. If you have any questions, anything at all, get in touch with me, okay? Sound good? All right, y'all take care.